Hello and welcome again to the second part of this session on violence in the politics of Southeast Europe. What we're going to be trying to do in this section is to begin our exploration of theories to explain the occurrence of large-scale interethnic violence in the 1990s and possibly generally. And I want to begin by presenting a theory that comes to us from the perspective of political sociology. And this is a theory developed by Anthony Oberschall. Anthony Oberschall is a political sociologist who comes in. He is looking at life and the experience of violence in communities, in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Croatia. And the first thing that he finds is that these conventional explanations that we examined in the last part of the previous segment of this presentation generally seem not to apply. Let's try to look at that in more detail. Oberschall looks at the violence that happens and first says violence, despite the violence being explained and often described as violence among neighbors, as violence that occurs as neighbor on neighbor, cannot be explained by looking at relations between neighbors. First of all, because there are very few reports of long-standing tensions between neighbors predating the period of violence, and second, because most of the violence that occurred, there are some exceptions, did not take place among neighbors. Most of the violence that we know about was violence that involved action by military forces or paramilitary forces against civilians, that is, by people from outside a community coming in and committing violence in that community. Second, it says violence cannot be explained by ideology. That is, it cannot be explained by the disposition of members of a particular ethnic group to support particular policies or goals described as national or nationalist, because there is not strong evidence that support for policies like this existed at anything like a consensus level, either before the war or indeed during the war. Third, violence cannot be explained in terms of ethnic and religious difference. Because there isn't good evidence that these are at all times, or even at most times, fundamental motivating elements for social action among people. And even if they are, suppose we take, for example, religion as an instance of motivation for social action, there are no religious principles that advocate violence. At best, you could say that religion is used as a stand-in for identity and as a pretext for other motivations for violence. Fourth, violence cannot be explained by crisis or by the breakdown of the state, and this is because if you want to go through the territory of the former Yugoslavia, there are places where the authority and the functioning of the state broke down, and there are places where it did not break down, and the structure, the pattern of state breakdown does not match the pattern of violence. So instead of this, if you want to look for a pattern of violence, you see a recognizable pattern. In every place where violence occurred, it was organized. It was not spontaneous, and what was especially organized about the violence was the origins of violence, that is, the degree of political and ideological and media work that went into making violence looking acceptable. So the real question that we're dealing with is, how does violence come to appear acceptable as a resolution to problems? This is where Oberschall introduces his understanding of frames. So his argument is that people moved from a normal frame of understanding difference and interaction and rules that they had to follow into a crisis frame. So let's talk for a moment about the normal frame. In the normal frame, think about your own everyday lives. For most people, most of the time, the existence of ethnic or national difference, the existence of religious difference, is not experienced as a problem. All of us experience this, and probably most of the time we regard it as a source of pleasure. It's a factor that accounts for minor differences in the inclinations or understandings or habits of individuals, leading to things that we enjoy. The availability of different types of restaurants to try, that sort of thing. What happens when situations change so that people have the feeling that they are under threat, either as individuals or even more often as members of a group, that their existence is threatened, this is when people move into a crisis frame. And what are some elements of the crisis frame? First of all, the crisis frame changes the ways in which history is used. Historical memory is used not as a source of learning or understanding, or as a way of understanding obligations in the present, but as a source of grievance and as a pretext for revenge. And in the process of this transformation, members of the groups that have now been defined as opposing groups are defined, all of them, as enemies. All members of groups are postulated as enemies, and most importantly, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants in the event of a violent conflict is erased. And we've been able to see this in the kind of mythologies that develop in times of conflict. One of the myths that develops, for example, in several villages is the myth about the grandmother in the village who, from the window of her village house, is acting as a sniper, is shooting at passersby from a different group. There are no confirmed events of this actually happening. It probably never happened. But the fact that the story circulated and the fact that it was very widely believed indicates that intellectual effort went into, and social effort went into, eliminating the distinction between combatants and non-combatants and classifying all members of opposing groups as an enemy. And once all members of opposing groups are defined as enemies, then comes the proposal that elimination of the group is the solution to the problem, is the way to eliminate the threat to the group. And what is the motor that shifts people from the normal frame of understanding ethnic and national and religious difference to this crisis frame that leads to violence? In a word, it is fear. So none of this can be explained without accounting for the activity of institutions, political institutions, media institutions, educational institutions, religious institutions, in encouraging and spreading fear of members of the other group, moving people into this crisis frame, creating the environment in which violence becomes possible. But I want to move into some more detail in that in the next segment.